Hello friends, welcome back. Welcome to Understand ECG series. This is the third talk of the series. I hope that you have watched the first two videos on YouTube of Understand ECG. I assume that you have liked the information and so you are continuing with the third talk. Welcome again and thank you very much for watching. Here we'll be learning about few more important novel concepts regarding ECG. And I guarantee you, you will not get any of this information in any of the standard textbooks or anywhere on the internet. Up till now, we have learned that ECG is not the recording of the electrical activity of the heart, but it is the deformation of the isoelectric baseline under the influence of the voltages of the wavefront of sequential activation of cardiac chambers. So I think this is now clear in the mind of everybody of us. We have also learned that in ECG, the x-axis gives us the absolute real values of the time duration, whereas the y-axis tells us the relative perceived values of the voltages. So let's begin today's talk and dive deep into the ECG. We'll draw the left atrium, we'll draw the right atrium, we'll draw a thick left ventricle, and then we'll draw the right ventricle which is wrapped around the left ventricle. Now these are the four cardiac chambers from an anatomical point of view. From the ECG point of view, the right atrium and the left atrium, they constitute a single block. We call them a single block because the current can flow easily and uninterrupted in that block. In the same way, the left ventricle as well as the right ventricle, they constitute a single electrical block. Again, the same thing, we call them as a single block because the current can flow easily uninterrupted in that block. These two distinct electrical blocks are connected to each other with the help of the AV node. Now, AV node is the only connection between these two blocks, and current can flow from the atria to the ventricles only through the AV node in normal situations. Let's draw our SA node here for diagrammatic representation purpose. To learn the long axis of the heart, let's draw a person with the torso, the right hand and the left hand. This is more or less the anatomical position of the heart. The point that I want to make here is that the long axis of the body is in this direction, whereas the long axis of the heart is in this direction. So they are not the one and the same. And our lead 2 is the lead which looks at the heart from this direction. So any activity, any wavefront coming from the base towards the apex, that is from above downwards towards the below, will be actually coming towards our lead 2, and we know when the wavefront is traveling towards the lead, it is recorded as a positive deflection. Now this was regarding the frontal plane of the body. For the transverse plane, let's draw the torso, the right hand, left hand, the spine and the sternum. Let's draw the cardiac chambers in an anatomical fashion. The left atrium, the right atrium, the larger left ventricle and the right ventricle wrapped around the left ventricle. Our V1 is located here and our V5 is located here. V1 looks at the heart from this direction. So the wavefronts traveling from the left towards the right will be coming directly towards lead V1. In the same way, the wavefronts traveling from the right side of the heart towards the left side would be coming directly towards lead V5. So the left to right traveling of the wavefronts would generate a positive deformation on lead V1. In the same way, right to left traveling wavefronts would generate positive deformation on lead V5. I have particularly selected lead 2, lead V1 and V5 for this lecture. These are kind of the representative leads. The lead 2 represents the wavefronts traveling from above below, that is from the base towards the apex of the heart. Lead V1 represents the wavefronts traveling from the left towards the right side of the heart, and our lead V5 is the representative lead for wavefronts traveling from the right towards the left side of the heart. We can learn the logic of the formation of our ECG waveforms and easily extrapolate those to the other leads. I have been using novel ways to explain the formation of the ECG in order to understand the things conceptually in our Understand ECG series. Now we'll be learning about what is circumferential spread of the activation and what is spherical spread of activation. You will not find any of these terms written in the standard textbooks or being taught by your professors or get them in the literature. You need to use your imagination, and I'll help you to do that in order to use them for understanding ECG. So let's use our skill of imagination one more time. Let's go and sit right beside our sinoatrial node, SA node. It will trigger the activation which will influence the neighboring cardiomyocyte and activate it. Now this cardiomyocyte will in turn activate its neighbor 10 cardiomyocytes. So all of these cardiomyocytes will in turn activate their neighbor 10 cardiomyocytes. 10 is just an arbitrary figure. The point that we are making here is every cardiomyocyte will activate its neighbor, and in this way there will be the propagation of activation, creating the wavefront of electrical activation of our atrial chambers. Looking at the atria anatomically, they are very thin wall structures. So this spread of activation is happening almost in a coplanar fashion. So every cardiomyocyte activates its neighbor in a coplanar circumferential fashion. The wavefront of activation of atria, which begins at the SA node and stops after the complete activation of both atria, is generating the voltage which is causing the deformation on isoelectric baseline of the ECG, and we are calling it as P wave. And in order to determine the width of the P wave in millimeters, we need to literally calculate how much millimeters it is on the x-axis with the help of the graph. Normally it is 2 to 3 millimeters, which corresponds to timing of 100 to 120 milliseconds. This circumferential coplanar progression of the activation wavefront takes around 100 to 120 milliseconds to cover the full left and the right atria. Correct. If you look at the right atrium, the SVC, the IVC draining into the right atrium, and if you look at the left atrium and the four pulmonary veins draining into the left atrium, these are so much thin walled chambers, but it still takes 100 milliseconds to cover their complete activation. So how much time will it take for the activation of the ventricle? Now do think about it. Ventricles being so thick chambers, one would imagine it would take at least 8 to 10 times more than the atria for their activation. If But when you look at the ECG, the QRS complex is only 120 milliseconds wide, which is around 3 millimeters wide. How is this possible? If the P wave is 100 millimeters, 100 milliseconds wide, how can the QRS complex be only 120 milliseconds? So let's learn how it takes only 120 milliseconds for the activation of the chunky ventricular chambers. Let's draw our SA node, our atrial block, our AV node, and our ventricular block. Now let's just partially divide the ventricular block into right ventricle and left ventricle. Now the activation which starts to flow in the ventricles, it is kind of taken by specialized wires in a very fast way to distant parts of the ventricles. The right sided wire is called the right bundle branch. The left ventricle has got two such wires, which is called as left bundle branch, dividing into anterior fascicular branch and posterior fascicular branch. So with the help of this wiring, the current which has traveled the complete atria, which has crossed the AV node and landed up in the ventricles, it is taken quickly with the help of the wires to the right ventricle with the right bundle with the help of the right bundle, and to the left ventricle with the help of the left branch and the anterior branch and the posterior branch. As soon as the current lands here, the activation starts to naturally flow towards the right ventricle. So this is what happened naturally. First activation starts traveling towards the right ventricle. But as this activation starts to travel, the current which was here is in a fraction of second transferred to here, the distant parts. So even before this cell to cell activation, even before this cell to cell activation has just begun, the current has already reached from here up to here, up to here, and up to here. So all the cardiomyocytes on the way, they have got activation. In this way. So in the atria, the wavefront begins at one point, the SNO, whereas in the ventricles it begins here, but it is instantaneously transferred here to distant parts, and kind of all these length the activation begins. So there are multiple wavefronts which arise from each and every cardiomyocyte. This way. So what this does is the complete ventricles, the right as well as the left ventricles, they are activated not with the help of progression of activation from one point, but from a larger length, means larger, which is slightly less than the atrial activation time. Now this is the main magic. Now the activation which begins as the SNO and then starts moving from cell to cell this way to cover the complete atria, it is comparable to a blast of firecracker. Hope you remember from the previous lectures we have used this firecracker example to understand that if a firecracker breaks here, then it will cause this deformation on the rope. So if this atrial activation is comparable to a firecracker bursting, the activation of the ventricles is comparable to a bullet. This is a gun. It is comparable to a bullet shot. So if a bullet is fired in this way, it will create a very sharp deformation to the rope. So this stronger voltage which is generated due to the movement of the wavefront from multiple points of the ventricles creates a stronger voltage explosion which is comparable to a bullet shot and gets and creates a very sharp bump on the isoelectric baseline. So one would ask, then why there are three spiky waves, not one? Why there is a Q wave, there is S wave, there is R wave? So let's understand. So in the ventricles, let's draw the ventricles first. This is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle. The AV node lands somewhere here on the ventricles. As soon as it lands here, initially the cell to cell movement of the activation wavefront begins. So in lead 2, when the activity is going in this direction, so this is our lead 2, and here the activation is going towards this side. So it is like the explosion, but the wavefront vector is going away from the lead 2, so it kind of creates a negative type of deformation on the baseline. But this does not long for a longer time. Quickly the wires, they take the current to the right ventricle as well as the left ventricle, and multiple cardiomyocytes initiate wavefront which then start covering. The some of the vectors of this activation is directed from above, from the base to the apex, this direction. So a very large voltage wavefront is created and the vector is directed towards the lead 2. So this downward deformation was initiated by cell to cell transfer, but even before it gets completed, it is overtaken by a very sharp gunshot like deformation of the ECG. So this now becomes a Q waves. Actually, this is the recording of a different wavefront which was overtaken by this gunshot like wavefront, creating this. Now with the help of the conduction system, the activation is passed on to the distant areas of the ventricles. Right ventricle is almost done, that is over. But in the left ventricle, let's draw it again. These branches bring the activation here, and then the activation begins to grow in these directions, correct? So it reaches up to the apex. So from above, downward activation is completed, and this timing is equivalent to the R wave timing duration of the R wave. But these basal areas, I mean the areas near the atria, the current from here and now it is traveling in this direction, they are remaining. So cell to cell activation in the basal segment is growing in this direction, right? So the final kind of explosion or final vector of the ventricular activation is directed from below upwards. So for lead 2, the activation front is going away, and so it registers a negative deformation. So now let's see on the isoelectric baseline, due to the septal activation or the RV activation wavefront, a first negative deformation is created. It is then overtaken by a very sharp deformation which is the major chunk of ventricular activation due to the help of the conduction system, and the terminal area, which is the cell to cell activation of the basal areas of the ventricle, it is here. So this area, this part of this green activation is gone because this is overtaken, and here it is gone. So in the summary, what remains is the, let's take a different color. I don't know which color. Okay, let's take this one. The summary, this was the isoelectric baseline, then this was the downward deformation, which was overtaken by the sharp upward wave, and then the second wave, and then the baseline. So what remains is this, then the first septal, then the major chunk of ventricular activation, and then the basal areas of the left ventricle. So this is how we get this spiky QRS complex of the ventricles, and the duration of it is only 120 milliseconds, and it is not a smooth walled deformation because the voltage of wavefront is very strong. Covered much of why the P wave is rounded shape wave, whereas the QRS complex are sharp waves. Now what remains is the formation of the rounded shape T wave. This we will cover in our upcoming subsequent chapters. So I hope the logic that I am trying to convey to you, you are getting it and understanding it. Give some time to yourself, try to digest the information, and use your imagination to go directly into the heart and see how things are working, why things are working. Don't just memorize things. Okay, this first wave is P wave, this is this much. Imagine, understand, and ask question. Seek for answers. Look at, see the video again and again, and try to understand the concept that I am trying to convey. So thank you folks, thank you very much for watching the video. I promise you that I will come up with the next video on the next Sunday. I try to summarize things in a very compact duration. I know I'm not a very perfect artist, you can see from this diagram, but I'm trying my level best. And I understand it is not written in any of the books or literatures anywhere, but this is a very real thing, and everybody needs to know this. And I hope this video series will be the medium for everybody to know, understand ECG in a fashion that I am trying to explain to you. So very grand thank you to you, and see you again in the next talk.